Welcome to this edition of Ask CCSA. I'm your host, Diane Squires, and today we will be continuing our discussion on the topic, Living Circular, Reducing the Effects of Inefficient Waste Disposal. And I say continuing the discussion because we started it back in April on our special Earth Day edition with our panelists from the iCare Recycling Project in Trinidad, with Grenada Grows, and with Recycling Partners of Jamaica. And if you have not seen that edition, I would highly recommend that you, after watching this discussion, that you go back and check out that one, which was on the CCSA YouTube channel on April 22nd. But today, we will be discussing another project which was rolled out in St. Lucia. And we'll be doing that with Mr. Ronald Roach, who is the Director of Wastewater and Sanitation of Unite Caribbean. And together we'll be talking about the Replast OECS project. So good morning. Hello, Ronald. It's great to have you. Fantastic to meet you, by the way, and great to have you with us here.
Good morning. Yes, fabulous to be here, and I look forward to our discussions.
Great. So first of all, tell us all and tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and of course about Unite Caribbean and the work that you do.
Sure. So my name is Ronald Roach. I am the Director of Water and Waste at Unite Caribbean and responsible for water and waste management projects for the company. Unite Caribbean is a Caribbean consulting company, and we operate in 4 thematic areas: governance, climate change, economic and social development, and water and waste. And I have quite a long history of waste management. Started my career in waste management in 1993, working mainly in Trinidad with the Trinidad and Tobago Solid Waste Management Company there. And I've, within the last 5 years, been involved in consultancy throughout the Caribbean, working on projects involving recycling, waste management, medical waste, and waste policies and strategies.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, we want to get right into Replast OECS. Tell us what this project was about. Kind of describe for us what you wanted to achieve.
Right. So the Replast OECS project was a project that started in May of 2019 and continued until August of 2022. And the objective was to create an incentivized public-private partnership for recycling within the OECS countries, starting with St. Lucia as our pilot territory and looking to expand to all of the OECS countries and indeed to the Caribbean. So we have worked with various governments and private sector entities to create the project, and the project has now come to an end, and it has morphed into another project called Recycle OECS. And yeah, we're quite excited about that project, which really seeks to build on what we have done with the Replast OECS project.
Mm-hmm. So from 2019 to 2022, and I know that you talk about Unite Caribbean supporting sustainable development and promoting regional cooperation to do that. What initially motivated the launch of Replast, and who were the partners who were initially involved?
Yeah, so unlike a lot of recycling projects that are started in the Caribbean, the Replast OECS was created from the demand side rather than the supply side, meaning that it was not just for the presence of plastic and beverage containers in the environment, but it was because in Martinique there was a bottle-to-bottle recycling facility that was operating severely under capacity, and they needed material to be supplied to them, and because of the size of Martinique, it could not just come from Martinique. So the genesis of the project was to find other sources of plastic material to supply that plant in Martinique, and St. Lucia, being a close neighbor to Martinique, was chosen as the first country to be involved in that project. And because the facility was located in Martinique, and of course Martinique is part of the French system, The project was, in fact, supported by the government of France through the French Development Agency. So they were the original funders of the project, and they contracted with Unite Caribbean to execute the project. Unfortunately, soon after the project started, that plant in Martinique actually closed its doors completely, and therefore, there was a hiccup quite very soon after the project started. So we then had to look for alternative markets, and it led us to developing a study to look at what markets are available within the region, and Honduras was identified as the next best opportunity. There were 2 plants operating in Honduras, and we had discussions and developed contractual arrangements with those plants to supply material to them. So because the Martinique facility closed, we had to look at alternatives, and Honduras became that alternative.
But isn't that something though? Because I think one of the major things that CCSA is trying to do is really to build these connections and collaborations. And it's interesting that you said the genesis of the project was because of that kind of challenge that a recycling plant in Martinique, which I know nothing about, and probably many people in St. Lucia didn't know anything about, that challenge existed. So clearly we do need to connect more around the region. But I want to then talk about what the recycling, take us through the process of what Replast really is. You have these, I'm assuming, collection points, and then you transport, and then you ship to Honduras. Walk us through what that process is, and maybe tell us about some of the challenges that you may have faced in rolling out the project.
Sure. So what we wanted to do at the start was to understand the existing situation within St. Lucia. So it was not just about, rushing into a recycling project, but doing the necessary baseline studies. So one of the studies that was done was understanding the amount of plastic waste within the waste stream itself, because there were no previous studies that quantified that into details. And one of the first activities then was to quantify that. So it was actually going out and taking samples of waste and separating it, and taking out the plastic bottles and the aluminum cans and so forth, and actually measuring that. So we were able to quantify not just the amount of plastics and beverage containers within the waste stream, but also to differentiate between material coming from cash trees versus material coming from Grosile, which was more touristic, versus material coming from Dennery and Vieux Fort. And so it gave us quite a good appreciation of the waste stream and the quantities of plastic that would be available for processing. We also did some market research in terms of the public's perception of recycling, and how the public would be willing to embrace recycling. So that those 2 studies in particular gave us a good basis for developing the recycling system. And what we did was we established a number of collection points. In total, it was 4 collection points in various parts of the country. So one was in Grosile, another one was in Castries, one was in Laborie, and then the final one was in Vieux Fort. So representing a range of characteristics of the country. Of course, Grosile being the tourist hub, Castries being the main city, Vieux Fort being another city in the south, and Laborie being a fairly closed community. That would allow us to test the different responses by the various publics in terms of their participation in the program. So, and of course, changing behaviors requires a lot of public education and a lot of awareness. And so we developed a number of public education tools. We developed a video series for schools in particular, a lot of messaging, both in English and in Creole, to cater for the local circumstances. And of course, social media was a big part of our public education campaign. So we developed that public education campaign to sensitize persons about what we needed, what we were about to do, and why they why they needed to participate. And of course, changing behaviors, incentivization becomes quite a useful tool, and we developed an incentivized program to encourage persons to participate. And what that program was that you were provided with points, you were awarded points for bringing in plastic based on the weight of the plastics. And then those points you were able to redeem. When you collected sufficient points, you were able to redeem on an online marketplace. That marketplace was set up as part of the project, and that's where our private partners came in to provide goods and services to supply the marketplace so that the public can redeem. And we have had a number of really important private sector partners that supported that, Massey and Heineken being two of the major ones, but there were many others, all of which we are thankful for, and which, as I said, provided product and service that the public can then redeem. So that incentivization really, got the ball rolling, really got people involved. And it's great also to note that whilst some people, of course, were attracted to the incentive, a lot of people came in because of their love for the environment, their concern for the environment, their desire to be part of the recycling activities, and weren't too interested in the incentive. So that was a refreshing.
So I do want to take a couple of steps back to when you started quantifying, all the types of waste that you could find in the different parts of the island. What did those results look like? What was the proportion of, say, plastic waste to, I don't know, organic debris or anything like that? Are those numbers that you can give us an idea of?
Yeah, sure. So within our countries, organic waste always represents the majority of the waste stream. So between 40 and 50% generally tends to be organic waste. In the case of St. Lucia, the plastic waste stream itself, the entire plastic waste stream accounted for 19% of the waste, and the PET bottles accounted for 3.6% of the waste. So it's quite typical for small island states. Our countries, when I say our countries, our tropical countries, our touristic countries, and so we do tend to have a higher percentage of plastic in the waste stream, and we do tend to have a higher percentage of PET plastics as well in the waste stream, because of course we drink more bottled water and soft drinks, and so because as we were discussing before, the heat, so we do consume plastics in higher quantities than perhaps the developed countries, but it's quite typical of our countries.
And then you talked about developing the system for recycling on a national scale, and you talked about getting buy-in and the incentives and so on. But walk us through how Replast then started to partner with local businesses and organizations, and tell us a little bit more about that reward system, how you established that, why you decided to establish that. And I'm saying that because you're familiar with the iCare project in Trinidad as well. And when we had that discussion in the Earth Day session, the rep from iCare was saying, it was purely voluntary. They were depending on civic mindedness of the public to gather up their bottles and so on and take them to the collections point. But you initially started with that incentivization. So tell us about getting buy-in from communities, businesses, other organizations.
Yeah, so it all depends on the culture and the awareness of recycling amongst different communities. So in Trinidad, with that iCare project, to a great extent, the society has been more conscious about recycling. There have been recycling programs in Trinidad for a number of years. We have had a paper recycling system for 20 plus years. Recycling of plastic was first introduced as far as 30 years ago. So we have had a greater culture of recycling in Trinidad. as opposed to St. Lucia. So St. Lucia, I mean, whilst there would have been some amount of awareness, to a great extent, people were not entirely familiar, and therefore we felt that an incentive program will really accelerate the change. So it is for that reason that we went with an incentive program. And in doing so, yes, we consulted with, a lot of stakeholders in the private sector. So we did that through a number of workshops, inviting people to come in and discuss recycling, discuss what we want to do, and, asking people to put their hands up. And there were those that were willing, and therefore we decided that, yes, this is the system that we would want to go with. In some other countries, of course, incentivization is direct. So you go there and you bring in bottles and you get a payment, you get a cash payment. In some of the developed countries, there are these reverse vending machines where you put in a bottle and then you either get cash or you get a voucher that allows you to get a redemption on the purchase of new soft drinks. And so
right.
But we found that we felt that would not be quite appropriate. It will require more security and it will require more logistics. And so we felt that having this program based on points would be more suitable. So what we did was we created a registration process, and when patrons registered, they would get a rewards card, and then every time they come in to redeem, they will bring that card, and that card will be updated with the amount of material that they brought, and therefore their points will be updated, so that they would be able to accumulate points and therefore determine the level of redemptions that they would want to achieve in the future. And we found that worked quite successfully. I mean, in terms of the challenges, one of the challenges we did face was that whilst we were able to reach a certain level of recycling, it was hard to expand on that because there were only a certain amount of private sector players that would be willing to contribute. And so there was that particular limitation in terms of the amount of material and the amount of collection points that we could establish.
Right. Which brings me then to kind of ask, how open were people to, gathering up their materials and taking them to the collection points that did exist? Were people open to that? Did you find that there was a positive response?
Oh yes, overwhelmingly so. We were quite happy with the results, and of course, the results were different depending on the location. So in the Gros Islet area, where there were a lot of tourists and expats and so forth, the response was the greatest, and we found that people were actually going around to communities along the beaches, along the roadsides, and picking up material. And I mean, again, to some extent, it was because of the incentive. Yes, incentive certainly helped, but to a large extent, people, yes, did in fact, they were concerned about the environment. They did care for the environment. They did care for circularity and so forth, and they did try to participate as much as possible. So, again, one of the other challenges was that this project happened during COVID times, and there would have been some amount of curtailment of what could have been because of the COVID situation. We actually launched collection points during COVID times, and therefore we had to have all the COVID protocols, and we know that persons would have been skeptical about coming out into public places, and so that certainly would have affected the participation. But when you look at it from a holistic point of view, I think overall we are quite satisfied with the amount of material that we did collect. Over the course of the project, we collected 160,000 pounds of material, and that was in the main shipped to Honduras. So we were quite happy with that, and the project has come to an end, but we're also happy with the fact that some components of the project did continue. So whilst we are no longer operating the collection points. There are a number of hotels and there are a few public entities that are still collecting, and the recycler is still collecting and transporting that material to its facility for processing. So there's some amount of continuity, and again, we're happy for that. But as I said, the project has now morphed into a wider project known as Recycle OECS. And in that project, now we're really looking to build on Replace OECS and to develop a more sustainable system, not just a project. That project is supported by the OECS Commission, and it's funded by the European Union, and it's a much more all-encompassing project that we're happy to be involved in as well, and that we think will take us to a point of sustainability for recycling within the entire OECS.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about it rolling out to the rest of the OECS. Are there specific countries in particular, or is it the entire OECS that you're going to expand Recycle OECS into?
So the Recycle OECS project is to set up a model system for all of the OECS, and that system, if I can quickly go into it, encompasses 5 pillars that we see necessary to have a sustainable system. And those 5 pillars are the technical pillar. There must be sound technical systems to be employed. There's the financial pillar, what finances recycling. There's the economic pillar, how do countries collaborate and cooperate to develop economies of scale, and also how does recycling impact positively on tourism and on the economy and so forth. Then there's the institutional and legislative pillar, because they need, voluntarism is great, but we need to have it ingrained in the law of the countries and so. And then finally, there's a public education pillar. So the model itself will apply to the entire OECS, but in terms of the project will be continued in St. Lucia, and then 2 other demonstration countries still to be determined, being finalized right now. So there will be 3 countries now involved. And it will give us the opportunity to also test different mechanisms for collection or processing and so forth. So at the end of it, we should really be in a position to say what works properly, what doesn't work as well, what and needs to be modified, and what perhaps is not suited to the countries at all.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because in the last discussion we had again on Earth Day, I think a lot of the panelists there, well, two in particular from iCare and Recycling Partners of Jamaica, talked about some of the logistical challenges that they would have experienced. So yes, you have the collections points. I think one of the challenges was with there being so much to collect and having a certain number of, in that pilot project in iCare, having a certain number of haulage contractors and then having to get more and so on. So there were things that were not foreseen that had to be dealt with. And then throughout the whole chain of activities to get to a recycling factory overseas, there must have been challenges. So as you roll out now to other countries, or you're setting up the model to roll out to other countries, what are some of the things that you're going to be looking out for to put things in place to avoid these things or to mitigate them?
Yeah, so it's about economies of scale. The logistical challenges will always be there, and we have to recognize that recycling for our small island states is never going to reach a point of financial viability. It's never going to be where the private sector can come in and run a recycling system as a profitable business. We have to see recycling as part of that circular system that is required based on environmental necessity. And therefore, that's why the whole issue of finance has to be, properly looked at, and the mechanism for financing the recycling systems has to be agreed upon. So there must be some external financing system. So for these projects, in the case of IK in Trinidad, it was funded. It has been funded mainly by our Green Fund here. In the case of St. Lucia in Jamaica, it's funded by private sector support, and that's great. But when at the level that we operate the projects, we can get private sector support. But when we look to expand on that and reach recycling levels comparable with the developed countries, and so we recognize that there's a lack of recycling partners and private sector partners to be able to fund the entire system, and therefore the funding mechanism based on a legislative approach becomes necessary. And for instance, in Barbados has a beverage container depository fund system. So when you buy a beverage in Barbados, you automatically pay for the recycling, the proper recycling and treatment of your beverage container there. So that's one system that has proven to work in the Caribbean. It doesn't mean that it's a system that has to be adopted by all. Certainly St. Lucia and Antigua and Barbuda right now, they are also looking at beverage container depository fund systems. St. Vincent has a different system based on an environmental levy for beverage containers. So there are a variety of financial mechanisms that has to be looked at in some more detail, and countries have to agree on what is the appropriate financing system. Until we do that, then we will always have these projects that show some amount of success at a pilot level, but then it becomes very difficult to scale it up to a fully national level. And we have to recognize that. And once we do, then the rest of it falls into place. So once you have the financing, then you can deal with the technical aspects, the collection aspects, and the shipping and so forth. So that financial pillar becomes a main pillar of recycling system. The other thing we have to recognize is that in a lot of these projects, we create a separate transport system, and then it makes it even more expensive. And one of the things we have to do is to be able to incorporate the collection of recyclables into our normal municipal collection. So it's not an additional expense, but it becomes part of the existing expense.
Yes.
It's difficult to do in these small stages, but when we reach a point where we're separating, in a lot of our countries, as much as 70% of the materials are recyclable. So when you start separating, 50% and so forth, then it means you can split your collection costs between recyclables and the general garbage, so that you don't have to have a separate system for collection.
Great points there. I'm so grateful for that perspective on the financial side, especially, and the legislative side, which I think will then affect the financial side.
Absolutely.
And you talked about 160,000 pounds of between PET and I think it was HDPE containers collected from the Replast OECS project. Was that your only measure of success? Can we talk about the impact that this particular project has or had over the 3 years or so of its lifespan? And how that's going to affect what you think you can do as Recycle OECS comes into play.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly, from an anecdotal point of view, there's been a lot of feedback about a cleaner St. Lucia. When it floods, there's less bottles to clog the systems and so forth. And that in itself is it's also a success. The feedback from the patrons, when the project was a project and there was going to be a finite end to the project, and when we were closing up the project, the amount of feedback we got from persons wanting it to continue, from even one of the things I didn't mention was that for the collection points, there were a number of volunteers who participated, and even the volunteers literally begged for us to find a way to continue the project. And so because they were so themselves so motivated about by the participation and the interest, and they were glad to be part of something that was positive and behavior changing. And so all those represented different forms of success. But I think one of the main indicators of the success of the project was the fact that it the project in itself was able to be morphed into a wider, more inclusive project and more sustainable activity going forward, which was the Recycle OECS project. So the OECS Commission themselves, at the end of coming towards the end of the Replus project, they got involved as one of the donors, and their interest was captured, and they saw the need not just to have the project being demonstrated in St. Lucia, but also to look at the entire OECS. So I think that in itself was one of the success factors of the project, that they were able to see the bigger picture and was willing to continue to be involved in an overall recycling model for the OECS countries.
Do you think it's had any impact at all on so there's less plastic going to the landfill, at least during the life of the project. But what about impact on the number of plastic containers overall that, do you think people kind of thought more about how much plastic am I actually using when I take this off the shelf? Like, what impact is this having? At that level, do you think there was any kind of impact at all?
I think to some extent, I think we do need to do more in that respect, in terms of talking about the 3 R's, so not just the R of recycling, but the other R's, reduce and reuse. And I think there more needs to be done. But certainly, I mean, from the volunteers' point of view, when they are present to see the amount of materials that have been collected on a daily basis, it's really every Saturday that the collection points operated, it was really a mountain of plastics that were brought in. I mean, when you look at those pictures, it does in fact paint the picture of our consumptive habits. And I think definitely there would have been some impact, but I think we now need to build on that and create that culture of looking first to reduce and reuse before we recycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And just talking about circularity, so we're taking these containers, we're sending them to a recycling facility overseas. What happens then? How is the loop closed?
Right. So one of the things we have to recognize is that we there's always talk about, well, why don't we recycle it right in our countries? And one of the preventing factors for that is the economies of scale. So these places that we send to, they would accumulate material from different places and be able to develop those economies of scale, which we do not yet have within our small islands. So that's why we need to, in the first instance, build volumes. We need to develop that culture of recycling, and we need each one of the islands to be able to develop their system for collection and segregation of recyclables and build volumes that eventually can be, as much as 10 years down the road, look to establish our own facilities within the region. From a circularity point of view, you do need to have bottle-to-bottle recycling. One of the plants in Honduras is, in fact, a bottle-to-bottle recycling plant. The other plant is taking bottles and making fiber with it, so make for use in carpets and filler for toys and that sort of thing. So that's actually downcycling. You're not creating a fully circular economy system with that. But it's important to recognize that we can't just build a plant, because we will end up like Martinique, where there's no supply, and then again, because of economics, that you then have to close the facility. So the project does look at that. It does look at what the volumes of the individual countries can supply. But one of the early findings is that the OECS in itself, even if we achieved a high rate of recycling, would not be able to facilitate a plastic recycling plant, because there's still not enough volumes within the OECS. So we can look at within the wider region, Dominican Republic and even Trinidad, are two locations where they're looking at having bottle-to-bottle plants, and then the market becomes even closer to us, and that circularity system can then be developed. But circularity is something that it's great to talk about, but it's a difficult road ahead because of the economies of scale of our islands, that we just have to recognize the realities of it.
Mm-hmm. And just for clarity, bottle to bottle means for every bottle that is recycled or sent to the plant, there's a new bottle that comes over that.
Right, exactly. So bottle to bottle, it's the technology exists for bottle to bottle, but it's a more complicated process than using bottles to manufacture fiber, for instance. So you have to ensure that it's food grade, and it means that the material has to be cleaned, it has to be sanitized, it has to be heat treated, and in the process itself, the cleanliness and the all those things have to be taken into consideration to ensure that when a new bottle is made, it meets all the food grade requirements. And so that process becomes more expensive than other recycling methods, but it is the only process that really ensures circularity. And again, that's where the legislative pillar comes in, the institutional and the legislative pillar, because you then would need laws to insist that in supplying bottles in the marketplace, that there is some recycled content in the bottle, and so that you ensure that there's a market. Because unfortunately, in our traditional linear system, that process of extracting oil and making a bottle is still far cheaper than the system to collect recycle a bottle, an empty bottle, and clean it and crush it. And that's the unfortunate reality. And we have to be mindful of that as well, and work within that system, but also in doing that to be able to incentivize the use of recycled plastic through a legislative process.
So through the entire project of Replast OECS, you certainly must have learned a lot of lessons. And there are many other countries who would be looking to, smaller, larger, looking to implement projects or programs like these, and to understand how that would work. What would you want to share with them as here in this informal setting as some of the main lessons that you've learned in rolling out a project like this?
Yeah, so certainly, as I said, I've been involved in recycling since 1993. I was part of the first plastic recycling program in Trinidad, and I think at that time in 1993 was one of the first in the English-speaking Caribbean. And since then, we have made the same mistakes. We believe that recycling can take place as a commercial venture. That when you talk to the waste management authorities, they think, no, leave that to the private sector. Let the private sector come in and set up their equipment and take the bottles and make new ones and sell those new ones, and they'll generate their own revenue. And so it certainly cannot work like that. It has not worked like that. In the best of times, it may just break even, or it may just generate a slight profit. But plastics, they're part of the commodity market system, and prices fluctuate based on the price of oil, based on the demand and supply, and so most times the prices of the commodities do not allow you to run a commercial operation. And therefore, we cannot continue to look at recycling as a commercial venture to be undertaken by the private sector. We have to recognize that recycling in itself is a form of disposal. We are generating waste, and we need to treat with waste, and we have the option of disposing of it in a landfill, and that landfill stays with us for the next 1,000 years. And there's a cost in managing that landfill and disposing of the waste. Or we take it and we recycle it, and we get to create that circular economy and depend less on our natural resources. And there are obvious environmental benefits to that, for which we have not calculated sufficiently the environmental costs of those things, and the positive environmental impacts that these will bring. So we have to be more holistic in our approach, and the approach has to involve not just the private sector, not just the public, but a public-private arrangement involving the public at large, the government, and the private sector, to be able to each do what it's best at. So government providing the policy and the regulations, and the incentives, the private sector providing the operations, and of course the public to have the awareness and the understanding and the participation. I think that's one of the main lessons, because other than that, we will continue to be running projects, and it will be all very lovely projects, but at the end of it, we're still back to square one.
No continuity.
System. And once we recognize that in the Barbados system that works, it is based on legislation, it is based on a financial system, and it's based on the public and the private sectors becoming intertwined, then that's really the main lesson to be learned, that we have to look at a holistic approach. The other lesson, I would think, is being able to recognize where we are, that we are in our infancy still, from a recycling point of view, and therefore a lot of time and effort needs to be spent in public education, and that public education again has to be all-encompassing. So we are still at a stage where individuals litter. So it's not just teaching them about recycling, it's teaching them still about care for the environment, concern for the environment, the depletion of our natural resources, the destruction of our income earning sources. Most of our islands are touristic in nature. We depend on tourists, and we need to have a pristine environment from an economic point of view. So we need to have that holistic public education approach that is not project-based, but it's institutionalized. So the ministries and the waste management authorities responsible for waste management and recycling, they should be the ones setting up those public education campaigns, and so with support from all the other donor agencies and the projects that are run. But it should be driven by those that are responsible. So the messaging becomes clear, becomes consistent, and it's not one person saying one thing and then another person coming and saying, another thing, and confusing the public. So those, I think, would be two lessons to be applied.
And thanks so much, Ronald. Thanks for sharing that. And overall, since we've come to the end of our time together, thank you so much for taking the time out to share the experience of Replast OECS, and also to share the challenges. And we know we have something to look forward to with the rollout of Recycle OECS and that model coming into play. But if people want to follow what Unite Caribbean is doing in other sustainable development projects across the region, how would they reach out to you or learn more or follow your journey? Where can they find you?
So Unite Caribbean itself has their website, unitecaribbean.com, and the Replast OECS project has their social media pages. Recycle OECS still has to develop its social media page, but in the next month or so, that should be happening. So you can look out for Recycle OECS, and certainly as the project develops, the public will hear a lot more about the project. So Unite Caribbean, Replus OECS, and hopefully soon Recycle OECS.
Recycle OECS. Thank you so much again.
Thank
It was
you.
lovely
That's
to
my
have
pleasure.
you. And to our audience who have joined us again today, thank you so much for joining us. And remember, once you've completed watching this discussion, head over to the April 22nd airing of this same topic for Ask CCSA and check out that discussion. And keep and stay tuned to the CCSA channels, because another Ask CCSA will be coming around so soon, and we want you to prepare your questions for our panelists then. Thank you so much. Take care.